Abigail, explain this to us, because Apple is out there saying iPhone demand in China has improved, or at least has stabilized, and then these numbers from Qualcomm tell a different story in China.
It's pretty interesting, Emily. So in terms of the quarter that they just reported, they did beat, as you mentioned, both top and bottom line estimates, but driving the stock down, because initially in the pre-market the stock reacted to the upside, is the fact that the third quarter earnings guidance of adjusted earnings of 70 cents to 80 cents, that range below $1 earnings per share. And interesting to what you were just talking about, the divergence between Apple saying that there's strength and Qualcomm having this weakness, it goes even deeper, because if you look at that third quarter guidance, and if you were to break down the royalties that you were talking about from Apple, those are really pretty impressive, but it tells you that the handset business, the core business, is weaker, really kind of matching some of the expectations that they've been talking about in terms of declining movement there. And this, to some degree, Emily, has to do with they're all about the high-end handsets. So the high-end handsets for Qualcomm really not doing very well, and unlikely to be made up by some of their other businesses, such as auto. About 20% of their business comes from non-handset business, and the high-end handset, that's a higher margin business, and unlikely to also be made up by some of the lower-end handsets. But that divergence probably has a lot to do with the high-end handsets that Qualcomm really features to or plays to more.
So let's talk about this number that we now know Apple is paying Qualcomm to settle this global legal dispute, $4.5 to $4.7 billion. How are investors responding to that?
Well, you know, so I spoke with Bloomberg Intelligence analyst Anand Srinivasan a couple times this afternoon, and his work that I was just talking about suggests that that payment is better than what he had forecasted, which is why the handset business, the core business, actually looks worse, which is why the stock could be selling off a little bit. So from that perspective, it looks pretty strong, at least relative to Anand Srinivasan's expectations. But, you know, Emily, I think that's something that investors are really going to want. You know, they say that the devil is in the details, and Qualcomm is saying that the terms are, I think what was the exact language here, in line with general practices. Investors and analysts are probably going to want a little more detail than that. But as far as that payment for the third quarter of $4.5 billion to $4.7 billion, it seems, according to at least Anand Srinivasan and some of the reaction from the stock, because it was actually down more in the after hours here. It's down, but off of the lows, you know, that's acceptable.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more about the details and what we know. You know, there are some analysts out there saying that this breaks down to $8 an iPhone. That could go up to the mid-teens. Is that number fixed, that $4.5 to $4.7 billion, or could it grow over time?
You know, Emily, that's a little bit beyond my area of expertise relative to Qualcomm and Apple, but I think that as time goes on, we'll have more information about that. And again, relative to what Bloomberg Intelligence is saying, that number is better than they had expected. So perhaps it can grow over time, but again, that's a little bit outside of my area of expertise.
All right, so Abigail, obviously you follow all the chip stocks. Talk to us about what you're looking ahead to when it comes to the broader semiconductor industry.
Well, you know, you've had such a run-up this year, and actually I should mention that run-up for Qualcomm, too. To some degree, this was a bit of a relief quarter, even though we do have a little bit of the sell-off. But when you put into the perspective of the 50% rise on the year for Qualcomm, you know, falling 2% in the after hours is not a huge move. But that's true, too, for the stocks. That semiconductor index on the year up about 30%, a really hot sector after the brutal quarter, fourth quarter. But the question is whether or not that can stay in place, because if you look at the trends, DRAM pricing, NAND pricing, the spot pricing for both of those areas of memory, they are declining. So you have chip stocks moving higher while there's lots of fundamentals that are moving in the wrong direction. It will be very interesting to see how that divergence plays out. But to your point about Apple talking about strength in China and for their iPhone, there was quite a tailwind today for some of those Apple suppliers. So it looks like there's going to really be some interesting action ahead to watch to see whether or not the pricing for memory and some of the other fundamentals, which again is going in the wrong direction, is correct, or some of these stock prices that are high as the sky. But at the end of the day, you can bet that they're probably going to come back together, which historically has happened.